Greeting to all YouTube viewers. I am Vansworth Mackenzie. This video is called the Gentile European Ku Klux Klan police force system that came down from the army that was established during the early colonial days as a protection for the settlers or the colonists as they were called in those days. During those days, it was the pirates of the Dutch, French, and the British who were the criminals, fighting and robbing the Spanish to get some of their territories of the so-called New World they had taken away from the natives. During those days, there were no police force system as such as we know it as today, apart from when the British sent out Wood Rogers to establish law and order in the Bahamas and to get rid of the pirates of the Bahamas. Also, this law police force system came about when the British gave Henry Morgan, Lieutenant Governor of the island of Jamaica, to remove and to clean up the buccaneer pirates from the West Indies and the Americas that he was a part of before. He was taken from his prison cell in the Tower of London and was given the title of Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. Also, this police force system was established when the British sent out Sir Robert Holmes in 1668 AD with a powerful army and a fleet of warships to further clear the waterways of the West Indies and the Americas of any remaining buccaneer pirates that might have escaped the attention of Morgan while he was trying to clean up the buccaneers to put an end to their criminal activities of the West Indies and the Americas against the Spanish. This police force system later came down to the cowboy days of the 1800 AD that became known as the Sheriff Marshal of what became known as the United States of America. This Sheriff Marshal police force system was also established as a protection for the settlers or the colonists against their many captive slave people, and also as a protection from other European settlers of their own people who used to rob, steal, and kill many of their own people to get the wealth they have, so as to become rich people. In those days of the Wild West of the 1800s, in order for a European person to keep their wealth, money, and their life, they had to hire many fast gunslingers to stay around them as a protection to keep what they had. These European crooks were known before as the pirates that later came down to the gangsters of the Roaring Twenties of the United States. Many of these pirates used to hang around in the island that became known as the Bahamas, the Cayman Islands, and Port Royal of the island that became known as Jamaica. That was a breeding ground for Dutch pirates, French pirates, and British pirates. History of the West Indian People, Book 2, explained that the island that became known as the Bahamas was the first set of islands Columbus saw when he crossed the Atlantic Ocean in 1492 AD to come to the so-called New World of the people of Europe. Columbus called the various islands of the Bahamas as the Lucayos Islands. History of the West Indian People explained that the name Bahamas was not known of before until 30 years later, when the name Bahamas came into existence, and its origin is unknown. According to Volume 1 of the Encyclopedia Britannica, page 798, there it explained that the island that became known as the Bahamas was inhabited by the peaceful Arawaks, who were given the name as the Lucayos people that came from the era that became known as South America, that take its name from Americus Vespucci. The encyclopedia explained that many of these Lucayan Arawaks were a peaceful set of people who were involved in fishing and farming, and they were not a cannibalistic people like that of the Carib people, from where the name Caribbean came from. The encyclopedia explained that When Columbus reached the New World in 1492, he landed on the island that he named as San Salvador. That is in the island of the Bahamas. The encyclopedia explained that when the Spanish took over from Columbus, who he was working for, they made no attempt to settle on any of the islands of the Bahamas, but they hunted down the Arawaks and enslaved many of them to death. From what I came to understand from reading various volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica, when the British came to take over the island of the Bahamas from the power of the Spanish, the island of the Bahamas were uninhabited by the various native Arawak people. So what the encyclopedia is explaining is that the Spanish enslaved the Arawak people of the island that became known as the Bahamas to death, or they just slaughtered off those Arawaks who did not die in the slavery experience of the Spanish. According to this encyclopedia, in 1629 AD, Charles I of Britain gave the island of the Bahamas to one of his ministers, but there were no attempt made by the British government to send out settlers to settle and colonize the various islands of the Bahamas so as to make it as a British colony. According to history of the West Indian people, the name Bahamas may have come from a Spanish-sounding Arawak word that became known as Bea, that meant bay. History of the West Indian people explain that many of the islands of the Bahamas continued to have the same Arawak name as they did in 1600. According to history of the West Indian people, the Spanish did not find any gold in any of the islands of the Bahamas, so they did not take any interest to settle on any of the islands of the Bahamas, apart from taking the Arawaks as slaves to work in the various mines and plantations of Cuba and in other islands of the West Indies, as well as on the mainland that became known as South America. History of the West Indian people explained that because the Spanish did not settle on any of the islands of the Bahamas, this is the reason why many of the islands of the Bahamas still have their old Arawak names that is still in use today. According to history of the West Indian people, the island Columbus landed on his first visit to the so-called New World, he named as San Salvador, but the Arawak people they named the island of the Bahamas as Gohanahai, which was the original name before Columbus came and changed the name of the islands. History of the West Indian people explained that during the 1800s, the island of San Salvador became known as Watling Island, that was named after famous pirates who had settled on the island of San Salvador. Pirate Watling of San Salvador made his men pirate men to keep the Sabbath day holy, and he was very strict about keeping it, and he himself did likewise. History of the West Indian people explained that in 1629 AD, King Charles I of Britain gave Sir Robert VIII various territory in the Americas, which the island of the Bahamas was included in this gift package. Sir Robert VIII himself never visited the island of the Bahamas, but a British settlement was made in what became known as New Providence of the Bahamas in 1629 AD. The first British settlers who came from the island of Bermuda to set up New Providence of the Bahamas as a British colony. History of the West Indian people explained that the first set of British settlers who came from the island of Bermuda to the Bahamas to establish the island as a British colony did so in a place of the Bahamas that was called Elitura in 1647 AD. According to history of the West Indian people, many British settlers came later from the island of Bermuda to increase the British population on the island of Bermuda. Due to the build-up of the British settlement on the island of the Bahamas, the Spanish used to attack the island of the Bahamas on a regular scale to drive out the British settlers from the island of the Bahamas. In 1633 AD, the French government of France gave certain islands of the Bahamas to their French aristocrats, but they did not make any attempt to set up a French colony on any of the various islands of the Bahamas. According to history of the West Indian people, in 1670 AD, King Charles II of Britain put a British landowner from the colony of the Carolina in what became known as the United States of America in charge of the island of the Bahamas. But he did not do a very good job in taking care of the island of the Bahamas. Due to his neglect, the island of the Bahamas became a breeding place for pirates to hang around in. History of the West Indian people explained that one of these famous pirates of the Bahamas was a Welshman by the name of Edward Teck, who was also known as Blackbeard. Because of his long black beard, he plaited and tied with a ribbon behind his ears. Blackbeard's usual way of dressing was in a purple velvet coat that had bright red breeches on his belt, and he always carried a pair of pistols and 2 daggers. Blackbeard's headquarters was in New Providence, part of the Bahamas, that is also near to what is known today as Nassau of the Bahamas. History of the West Indian people explained that Blackbeard was killed in an hand-to-hand fight that took place in 1717 AD in the island of the Bahamas. According to history of the West Indian people, in 17 AD, King George I of Britain sent Wood Rogers to restore law and order in the island of the Bahamas and to put an end to the pirates of the Bahamas, which he was very successful in doing so. After Wood Rogers put an end to the pirates of the Bahamas, he established a council of 12 men as judges with other officials of the island of the Bahamas to oversee law and order. History of the West Indian people explained that 200 of these council officials of the island of the Bahamas were former pirates who had surrendered themselves to be under the rulership of His Majesty King George I of Britain, of his government of the Bahamas. The action of Wood Rogers ended the loss of the stronghold of the British pirates of sea robbers of the West Indies and what became known as the Americas. The Spanish take away the island of the Bahamas from the Arawaks in 1684 AD, and they tried to take back the island of the Bahamas from the British in 1719-1720 AD, but the Spanish were unsuccessful in doing so. In 1776 AD, of the beginning of the American War from Britain, the Spanish joined with other various European settlers of what became known as the United States to attack Fort Montego of the Bahamas. The various European settlers of what became known as the United States who made their attack on the island of the Bahamas were Spanish settlers. They were able to carry off some of the cannon guns and other things from the island of the Bahamas without causing too much problem to the everyday life of the Bahamas. In 1782 AD, the Spanish held various European settlers of what became known as the United States to fight against the British. The Spanish were able to recapture the island of the Bahamas from the British, but a treaty was made between the British and the Spanish, and in the next year the island of the Bahamas was restored back in the hands of the British government. History of the West Indian people explained that before the news of the signing of the peace treaty between the British and the Spanish could reach the island of the Bahamas, the Spanish was driven out of New Providence of the Bahamas by Colonel Duvaux, who had less than 250 men with him. Colonel Duvaux was able to push out the Spanish from New Providence of the Bahamas by using different strategies and diplomacy to fool the Spanish in thinking that he had a large army of men, when he only had 250 men in his army. The Spanish governor, who was in charge of the island of the Bahamas, surrendered to the British settlers on the island of the Bahamas after a shot was fired at his house. The Spanish governor of the Bahamas came to realize that he was fooled by the British settlers' army of only 250 men, and he became very upset with himself to give up the island of the Bahamas to a badly equipped group of men. The Spanish governor was shipped off to the Gentile land that became known as Europe, and what was left of his army of men was sent back to the island of Cuba. According to history of the West Indian people, this was the last interference with the Spanish trying to take back the island of the Bahamas from the power of the British settlers of the Bahamas. Volume 1 of the encyclopedia, page 799, gave more light of knowledge about the history of the island that became known as the Bahamas. The encyclopedia explained that the government of Britain gave the island of the Bahamas to Duke of Albemarle and 5 other persons. The place that the encyclopedia called as Albemarle was in what became known as northeastern part of North Carolina, near the Roanoke British Island colony that was established there in 1585 AD. So this British Duke was a ruler of a town of the era that the British named as Albemarle in what became known as North Carolina of the United States. According to the same volume 1 of the encyclopedia, the men who were given various land in the island of the Bahamas was not enthusiastic about settling down in the island of the Bahamas. The few of them who did so were not very prosperous, and piracy became a way of life for many of them who did take up residency in the island of the Bahamas. Volume 1 of the encyclopedia explained that Wood Rogers, who were able to put an end to the pirates of the Bahamas, did so at his own expense, and very little monetary and military support came from Britain. Due to the lack of support from Britain, the island of the Bahamas remained poor and was open to the Spanish attack. The encyclopedia explained that the island of the Bahamas increased in population from many of more loyal colonists and their slaves who fled from the United States during the American Revolutionary War of 1775-1783 AD. The encyclopedia further explained that for a period of time, cotton plantation brought some prosperity to the island of the Bahamas. But when the soil would no longer give the abundance of cotton as before, slavery was abolished in the island of the Bahamas in 1834 AD. There were also the pirate buccaneers of what became known as the West Indies. These British and French pirates, who became known as the buccaneer, was formed during the 1600 AD in the West Indies, where they had their headquarters there for robbing and stealing at high seas. History of the West Indian people explained that during the early days of those pirate buccaneers, who were a band of British and French pirates who had settled on the island, history of the West Indian people called Taratuga. The island of Tortuga, according to a map shown in the history of the West Indian people, was not too far away from the island that Columbus named as Hispaniola, that became known as Haiti and Dominican Republic of today. According to a map of the Encyclopedia Britannica showing the island that was called Tortuga, and compare the map of the encyclopedia with that of the modern world map of today, the island of Tortuga is known today as the Cayman Island. The Cayman Island is located near the island of Cuba, Jamaica, and the island Columbus named as Hispaniola, speaking of the island of Haiti. According to the history of the West Indian people, the Arawak were the true native of the Cayman Island, who taught the French and the British pirates who had settled on their island how to cure meat by cutting the meat in pieces and smoking it on dry frame of green wood and slow fire. History of the West Indian people explained that the Arawak people called this craft of theirs as buccan. So this is how the pirates of the Cayman Island got their name as the buccaneers, because of this craft of the Arawak people curing meat and slow fire that they had called as buccan, that they, the pirates, had learned from the Arawak people. History of the West Indian people explained that many wild cattle and wild pigs were on the Cayman Islands that did belong to the Spanish who had brought them there. History of the West Indian people explained that the pirate buccaneer used to make a sideline living apart from robbing and stealing from the Spanish by killing many of the animals and selling their meats and skin to other European smugglers who used to pass by on their ships nearby the Cayman Islands on their way to Europe. Many of these European smugglers who did business with the buccaneers on the Cayman Island were not allowed by the Spanish to do any sort of business with their colonies of the West Indies or on the mainland that became known as South and Central America. The Spanish tried their very best to get rid of the pirates buccaneers that were stationed on the Cayman Islands by killing many of the wild cattle and pigs that were there on the island that was a part of the buccaneer business of making money. In 1635 AD, the Spanish attacked the Cayman Island, killing as many buccaneers they could find. According to history of the West Indian people, a new buccaneer leader by the name of Willis returned to the Cayman Islands and made a promise to have a continual fight with the Spanish, their enemy. The French government also took action of chasing away many of the buccaneers from the Cayman Island, and some of the buccaneers who were under the leadership of Wills went and settled in what became known as Central America. Speaking of what is now known as British Honduras, while the buccaneers were in British Honduras, they became allies to the governor of the island of Jamaica against the Spanish, and they were also allies to the French colony of Haiti against the Spanish. One of the most famous outstanding of these buccaneer pirates was known as Henry Morgan, who was the son of a Welsh farmer, and his uncle was lieutenant governor of the island of Jamaica at the time of Morgan. History of the West Indian people explained that when Morgan was a young man, he became a seaman, and later he sailed with Admiral Penn and General Venables, these two British men who were responsible for the capturing of the island that became known as Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655 AD. Morgan also became the captain of these dispersed buccaneers. In 1668 AD, the governor of Jamaica was told that the Spanish were planning to attack the island of Jamaica. So the governor sent Morgan to Cuba to find out if the report he heard was of a true report or just a false rumor. Morgan sailed from Jamaica with 10 ships and 500 men, and he sailed towards the island of Cuba. But when he went to Cuba, he found out that Havana, which is the capital, was too strong for him to attack. So he took his men to Puerto-Príncipe, which is the town of Cuba. Morgan and his men robbed the town and carried off 500 cows that the Spanish settlers paid him as a ransom for peace to leave them alone. Morgan went to his ship and notified the governor of Jamaica of what he had learned pertaining to the Spanish plan to attack the island of Jamaica. Morgan told his buccaneer pirates that he was going to attack what was known as Portobello, which was one of the strongest Spanish settlements at the time. According to a map that is in History of the West Indian People, showing the area that was known as Portobello of that time, is now known as Panama, Guatemala, and Belize. That is near the land area that is known today as Mexico, when compared this map with that of the world map of today. Morgan sailed to the mainland that became known as South America, and he took 23 canoes loaded with his men to make the attack on the Spanish settlement of Portobello. While Morgan and his men was on their way going towards Portobello, they met with an escaped prisoner who became their guide to lead them into the attack on Portobello. Morgan and his men overpowered the Spanish guard before he could give any alarm to the rest of his Spanish settlers and seized 3 districts of the area leading to the city. The second settlement was more difficult than the first, and Morgan and his men was only able to take the second settlement when he climbed over a ladder and the governor who was defending the city was killed. While Morgan and his men was able to capture the third town, the governor of Panama came out with 300 men, but the buccaneers were able to defeat the governor of Panama and his men and forced them to pay him a ransom of 100,000 Spanish coin in 1668 AD that was known as pesos. The action of Morgan caused much alarm in Europe and Britain, and Spain and Britain signed a peace treaty of friendship with each other that did apply to all their subjects and colony of their new world. Before this news of the peace treaty could reach the Americas and the West Indies, Morgan went and attacked a city of Venezuela that was called Maracaibo, and after the buccaneer robbed the city, the buccaneer came to realize that the Spanish repaired the fort and had their cannon guns ready to prevent them from escaping. The Spanish general with 3 ships were waiting for Morgan and his men to try to escape. But Morgan turned a small ship into a fireball that he was able to get alongside the general's ship and cause it to sink. Another Spanish ship ran ashore and was set on fire by the ship crew, and the third ship was captured by Morgan and his men. Morgan and his men were able to escape from the Spanish and sail back to Jamaica. While he arrived back in the island of Jamaica, he was reproved by the governor of Jamaica for doing more harm to the Spanish settlers than it was necessary to do. The Spanish was checking around the coast of Jamaica, and the governor of Jamaica became aware of it, and he already appointed Morgan to be the chief commanding officer of all warships of Jamaica and to deal with the Spanish according to his will. In 1671 AD, Morgan, with his buccaneer pirates, attacked the city of Panama and set it on fire. And a second peace treaty was signed between Britain and Spain to establish a more solid friendship between the two colonial powers to prevent the British pirates, buccaneers, from attacking their colonies. The government of Britain took a drastic step to stop Morgan from attacking the Spanish settlement in the West Indies and the Americas. The British government also set laws and made decrees for Morgan and his buccaneers pirates to follow, also for other British settlers of the West Indies and the Americas to follow, in keeping the peace with the Spanish of their New World. Morgan was taken prisoners and was sent back to Britain, and he was jailed in the Tower of London. But King Charles II of Britain released Morgan from his jail cell and sent him back to Jamaica and gave him the title of Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. While Morgan had the office as Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, he tried his very best to take action against the buccaneers of the West Indies and the Americas that he was a part of. The British government even took a stronger action to put an end to the pirates, buccaneers of the West Indies and the Americas by giving Morgan a few small speedboats to patrol the waterways between the island of Hispaniola and Cuba. In 1668 AD, Sir Robert Holmes of Britain arrived in the West Indies with a powerful army and a fleet of ships to further clear the waterways of the Americas and the West Indies of any remaining pirate buccaneers who might have escaped the attention of Morgan. Morgan died in 1688 AD. The French government of France also took some steps to remove any remaining buccaneers that might have left in the Cayman Islands. The French also took a drastic step in the French part of the island of Hispaniola that they named as Saint Dominic, now known as Haiti, to remove any remaining pirates that were there. Before the buccaneer was driven out from the Cayman Islands and the island of Haiti, they made themselves masters of these islands of the West Indies. According to the history of the West Indian people, many of the buccaneer pirates move away to the South Seas, and they prey upon the East Indian Shipping Company of the Madagascar era of robbing them quite often. The island of Madagascar is located in the area of the world that the Gentile people of Europe call as Africa. Other buccaneers went and joined up with the logwood cutters and set up a small settlement along the river of Central America. The buccaneers of Central America were called bay men by the Spanish settlers of the era that had many fights with the buccaneers because they often attacked the Spanish camp on a regular scale. In 1798 AD, the Spanish were defeated by the British, and the bay men or the buccaneers of Central America were left alone. The Spanish settlement of Honduras later became known as British Honduras, and the era became a British colony after the British defeated the Spanish. History of the West Indian people explained that although the days of the buccaneer were ended, yet there were low-class pirates that used to lurk around the era of the world that became known as the Bahamas for another 50 years. My reason for going so deep into the pirate story of the Gentile people of Europe is to show that before the coming of the European people to their new world of the various natives, there were no crime rate among the various natives before the coming of the Gentile people of Europe. It was the European people who came to their captured new world were the criminals of robbing, stealing, and killing to get rich. Before the coming of the people of Europe to their so-called new world, there were no homeless people living on the street, eating from out of garbage cans. There were no drug addicts, no alcoholic, no winos, and no male prostitute or any form of prostitution or homosexualist people among the various natives of the so-called New World before the coming of the people of Europe. There were no rent and tax-paying people among the natives before the coming of the people of Europe, who came and set up their system of rent and tax-paying people to get rich from their many captives who became their citizens. All the various natives used to live together as a family unit, living from off the land as how Yahweh made things to be. The Gentile people of Europe came and established their system of corruption and violence to bring in much revenue from their many conquered slave people who became their citizens to get rich. So the pirates and the gangsters of the European society became the police officers, lawyers, judges, probation officers, and prison officers of the European law system that many of their captive people fall into. Because technically speaking, the police force system of the European people that came down from the pirates to the Sheriff Marshal of the cowboy era was made for their many captives to fall into, as well as other European people who became criminals against other European people of their system. So this is the reason why the prison system of the United States is full up with many Amite people who they name as Negroes, niggers, and black people. Because in reality it was built for their many captives, and it is also a business for the court system to make money. The lawyers, the probation officers, police officers, and prison officers to be well paid for their service of the European law system. This is also the case in Australia, New Zealand, Southwest Africa, or wheresoever the European people go and set up their colonies and their police force system as a protection for the settlers. Many of the native people became the victim of the European police force system. The funny thing about this story, many Amite men and women joined the European Ku Klux Klan police force system after slavery was abolished by the British as a good paying job with many good fringe benefits as a police officer. Many of these Amite men and women police officers used their European police badge as a sign of authority to brutalize and take advantage of their many Amite brothers and sisters of their community to show how good a police officer they are to their European police system that was established for the protection of the settlers. The reason why many of our Amite police officers behave this way toward their own struggling and oppressed people, it is because they are suffering from slavery and colonial mentality and stupidity. They do not have any knowledge of how the European police force system of today came about, that take on different names and branches as a governmental body around the world that was established by the European family who had set up this system to benefit themselves. To give one a good example of how many Amite people, Amite police officers and judges of the European police system treat their own people. One only has to go to the police station or to the courthouse to see how many Amite police officers, Amite judges of the European law police force system treat their own Amite people who came to their courthouse by way of the police officer without any kind of respect and dignity because of their European badge and guns that were given to them as a sign of authority over their fellow Amite people, as well as these judges who see themselves as the aristocratic people of today in the European law system because of their wealth and the good paying jobs, and they forget about where they're coming from because they are not a part of the struggling people anymore. So to them, they're a part of living the good life of the European people, of their good rich society that they become a part of. It was the same way during the colonial slavery days. Certain Amite men were given the position as foreman slave over their own Amite people as a sign of authority to keep their own people in check. The Belgian people of the Congo did the same thing. They would use many Amite men as soldiers to shoot and kill and burn down many of their own people's houses, just to show their loyalty to the Belgian colonial invaders who had rulership over the Congo. Many of these Amite soldiers of the Congo was used by the Belgian colonial rulers to cut off children, women, and men hand and foot, to force them to send more rubber product to Belgium to make King Leopold into a rich man of Belgium. And they did it with joy to please their colonial masters. The same is true for the Saudi Arabian Muslim people who use foolish Amite people like Boko Haram to shoot and kill and burn down many of their own people's homes, to send fear in the heart and mind of their own people so as to set up a Muslim government in Nigeria. And they did it with joy because they are very foolish, stupid people who have no sense of value and sense of responsibility to their own people, but are stool pigeon for other colonial rulers. Sad that they have control over. I also had a personal bitter experience dealing with various lawyers while I was living in New Jersey because of a rip-off mortgage that I had in 2008 of a 4-family house I had bought, paying $6,000 per month with all sort of repair problem I had no knowledge of until I became the owner of the property, simply because the Jewish lawyer I had used for the closing was involved with the real estate people and the mortgage people. So he did not explain much to me as far as the bad sign of buying a property in the United States. After owning the property and making all sorts of repairs and paying $6,000 per month, I went to various lawyers to see if I could get the mortgage payment to reduce to an affordable payment per month, which cost me another $17,000 to these lawyers, and get nowhere. And finally the house went into foreclosure in 2009 because I could no longer afford to pay $6,000 per month from my pocket. One of these lawyers I paid $6,000 to told me that once a person pay their lawyers money, even if they were ripped off by their lawyers, they cannot get back their money from the lawyers, because lawyers do not take other lawyers to court because it's going against the family of lawyers. So it is laws that were made by thief for thief to benefit other thief. This is the reason why the system of the United States and the colonial world of the European people are so corrupted. If one was to go to Australia, New Zealand, Southwest Africa, and Canada, they will see that the police force system was designed and set up for the protection of the settlers of these places, and it was not set up for the protection of the various natives of these places. This is the reason why many European settlers of Australia, Southwest Africa can commit all sorts of crime and get away with it, because the system was designed and built for them. The same is true in what became known as South Africa, where many Amite police officers beat and brutalized many of their own people in the name of the European law system, while many European settlers of South Africa get away with all sorts of crime and wickedness that they, the Amite police officer, have no authority and control over, because they were employed by the European settlers of South Africa that established their laws system to suit themselves. So many of these Amite police men of South Africa was employed to keep their own people in check according to the European law system. So it is just like the Al Capone days of Chicago and other gangsters who had their own policemen under their control to carry out their law and order of their system. Because their system was built upon crookery and scheming to get rich from their many captive people who became their victims of their law system that many of their captive are not knowledgeable of and fall into. So this is the reason the European law system the European law system we are living in, that one has to go through day by day with all of its crookedness of laws to get rich. I do not want anyone to misunderstand where I'm coming from in this conversation, because in today's world of the people of Europe, there must be policemen to oversee the crimes that came down from the European colonial slavery days, that they did establish, that has its effect on our life and world of today, where many of their captive people copy their ways of crime and wickedness to get rich in our world of today. I also want to point out that the European television system and the video system of its violence and crime have helped to influence many young people's mind towards crookery, violence as a way of life in our world of today. I want to thank YouTube for their site of knowledge and enlightenment to the mind of many people who might tune into their site. I do hope that many people may keep on doing so to gain much knowledge from the site of YouTube. Very people of today have any knowledge of how the police force system come about, apart from their seat as a police system that taking care of the publics. Thank you, YouTube, for allowing me to bring out this video here on your site. I did not mean any harm as such, but again, a lot of people need knowledge, and very few people have any sort of knowledge about what I've written. So again, I'm trying to bring some enlightenment, mainly though to the people of Am, because as I said before, many of them are sleeping and dreaming and living in fool's paradise and have no knowledge of what the real world is all about and what this law system of the European system came about, that have many of them in captivity and bondage and oppression. So again, it is the truth. Take care.